So for this fourth lecture, I made a PowerPoint slideshow. Instead of scrolling through a handout, I'm going to show you several screens of PowerPoint to teach you about seconds and thirds, how to identify seconds and thirds of different qualities, and also how to get used to writing them. Okay, so this is Chapter A, Lecture 4. In the previous lecture, I talked to you about the intervals that basically come in one quality and that we call perfect. The unison, the fourth, the fifth, and the octave fall into this category. With just a couple of exceptions, the diatonic intervals of these sizes are perfect. By diatonic intervals, of course, I mean the intervals that can be made with the notes of one key signature. So if we stay, for example, in the key of C major and we use only the natural notes, we're going to essentially get perfect unisons, perfect fourths, perfect fifths, and perfect octaves. There's a little bit of an exception because we can have an augmented fourth, F up to B, or we can have a diminished fifth, B up to F. But otherwise, these intervals are perfect. When we start to add accidentals to the natural notes, we may create chromatic intervals. These would be intervals that can't exist in a single key signature. They might have strange combinations of flats with sharps, or they might have double sharps or double flats. When we take a perfect interval and we make it a half step larger, it becomes augmented. When we take a perfect interval and we make it a half step smaller, it becomes diminished. What is true of these intervals is also true of their compounds. So if you see something that is like a fourth, let's say it's from C3 up to F4, because the 11th is a compound of the fourth, it too will tend to be perfect, but it might be augmented or it might be diminished. A compound interval has the same quality as the simple interval that is an octave smaller. And the 4 bullet points that are a little farther down on this slide show you that if you increase a perfect fourth by a perfect octave, you will have a perfect 11th. And if you increase an augmented fourth by an octave, you'll have an augmented 11th. And then a similar thing will happen with the 12ths. Now we'll cover the rest of the intervals, and we'll start in this lecture with the seconds and thirds. These intervals come in 2 qualities. They can be major or they can be minor when we are restricting ourselves to diatonic intervals. Seconds and thirds are never perfect in the same way that a fifth is never a major fifth or a minor fifth. A second will be a major second or a minor second, depending on whether it is a half step or a whole step. So I've shown you a piece of the keyboard on this slide, and this is just to remind you that the places where there are whole steps or the places where there are half steps depends on whether there's an intervening key in between. So as you see in the C major scale that I've written at the beginning of staff line A, the half steps are between E and F and between B and C. And we will see those half steps when we look at the keyboard. We'll see that there's no black key in between those 2 white keys. Then on the right side of the staff, you can see that I've written the seconds that we can have in the key of C major. So we have a second from C to D, a second from D to E, etc. Again, the places where we have the half steps from E to F and from B to C, those are the places where we have minor seconds. The other 5 are major seconds. Thirds are also either major or minor. A third will be a major third if it consists of 2 whole steps, and it will be a minor third if it is a step and a half. We can see that there are 3 places where we can move from a natural note up to the next natural note and then the second natural note after that, and be going 2 whole steps in a row. Between C and E, we have 2 whole steps, C, D, E. Then from F up to A, we have 2 whole steps, F, G, A. And also between G and B, we have 2 whole steps, G, A, A, B. On the musical staff B, I've written the thirds that can be created using the notes of the C major scale, And I've used whole notes to represent the notes that are really the notes that I want you to think of as making the interval. The black note head in the middle is just showing you the note that's in between. So those 3/3 that I just pointed out, C to E, F to A, and G to B, are marked as major thirds. The other thirds are minor thirds because they include the half step EF or the half step BC. So here, going from D to F, there's a half step from E to F. So overall, the interval is a step and a half. Here, going from E to G, again, one of those seconds is a minor second. And the 2/3, A to C and B to D, both include the half step from B to C. So they're each a step and a half. In that way, I hope it's easy to see what makes a third a major third or what makes a third a minor third. So far, we've stuck to the notes that are in the C major scale, and therefore we've seen only major and minor seconds and major and minor thirds, diatonic intervals. If we use odd combinations of intervals that can't coexist in a single key signature, we will have chromatic intervals. And once we move into the realm of chromatic intervals, we'll find some seconds that are even larger than a major second, and we will refer to those as augmented seconds. Or we may have a second that is even smaller than a minor second. It will actually be enharmonically equivalent to a perfect unison, and that is a diminished second. Here's this augmented second. E flat to F would be a whole step, but E flat to F sharp is a step and a half. Therefore, we consider this an augmented second. It's not a minor third because only 2 letter names are spanned. It is enharmonically equivalent to the minor third from E flat to G flat, but in order to accurately identify it, we have to say that it's a second, and it's an even bigger second than a major one, therefore it's augmented. And the E sharp and F natural are so close together that they're really the same note, but because the size is a second spanning 2 letter names, we need to call it a diminished second and not a unison. This diagram gives you a summary of the qualities: perfect, minor, major, diminished, and augmented. So over here on the left side, you can see that as we go farther over to the left, the intervals are getting smaller. And then over here on the right side, as we go to the right, the intervals are getting larger. And then each of these lines represents one of the categories or families of intervals that I've been talking about. The unison, fourth, fifth, and octave are such that in the middle we have the standard quality, perfect. But if we go smaller, we get a diminished fourth, say, or a diminished octave. And if we go larger, we'll get an augmented interval. This is also true of their compounds, such as the 11th or the 12th. Then in the second line, there's the other category of intervals that we've started to talk about, which includes not only seconds and thirds, but also sixths and sevenths. And it also includes their compounds, the 9th, the 10th, the 13th, and the 14th. Here in the middle, we have the smaller size minor and the larger size major. If we go even smaller than a minor interval, we get a diminished interval. So all of these intervals could be diminished. And then if we go even bigger than major, we would get an augmented interval. So again, like the unisons, fourths, and fifths, seconds and thirds can be augmented. They just can't be perfect. You should learn the qualities of all the seconds and thirds that can be made with natural notes. In other words, go back to lines A and B on my previous slides and look at which seconds in the C major scale are major and which are minor, and then which thirds are major and which are minor. And just think about where the whole steps and where the half steps on the piano keyboard are. You should learn these intervals well enough so that you really don't have to think about it. You don't have to count half steps on your fingers. You don't have to wait for a few seconds while your brain turns things over. You ought to just be able to look at them and recognize them. Then from there, consider how adding accidentals will either change, it should really say the quality, will either change the quality of the interval, making it larger or smaller, or produce an interval of the same quality if both intervals are affected by the same accidental. So let's take a look at 2 seconds and see how adding accidentals affects them. We'll start with the major second, GA. If we add some flats, adding a flat to the top note makes the interval smaller. This is a minor second. But if we add an accidental to both notes, if we flat them both, we haven't actually changed the size of the interval. The distance from G flat to A flat is the same as the distance from G to A. We've just overall moved the interval down. We can change the size of the interval too by adding a sharp. If we put a sharp on the lower note, we're making the interval again smaller. So G sharp to A is a minor second. G sharp to A sharp is not a different size from the original. We've moved both notes up a half step, but the distance between the two notes is still a whole step. It's a major second. But then if we take that major second and we move the lower note up even more by making it a double sharp, now this is a minor second again. The next two would be very unusual combinations of accidentals. There really aren't key signatures where you would have both a G natural and an A sharp, but there would be reasons to have those two notes together. Here, because we've added a sharp to the top note, we've moved the notes farther apart from each other and made this an augmented second. And then over here, adding a flat to the lower note, we've done the same thing. We've moved the two notes farther apart from each other, and this is therefore also an augmented second. E to F is a minor second apart, and that means that when we make it a half step bigger by either sharping the F or flatting the E, we now have major seconds. So the first two examples here are major seconds. If we put a flat in front of both notes, it doesn't change the size of the interval. E flat, F flat is still a minor second. But if we then put a double flat on the E, now we've moved the E 2 half steps lower, while the F is only moved 1 half step lower, and this is back to being a major second. A sharp on both of the notes, again, keeps this as a major second. And we can do the same thing with thirds. Take some time on your own to take a major third, like the one from F to A, and then look at what different combinations of sharps, flats, a sharp and a flat, maybe using a double sharp or a double flat. Look at how those different combinations change the major third. D to F is a minor third that's made with natural notes. And so here the results are a little bit different. Now, this is what I have to tell you about seconds and thirds. And once you feel comfortable with seconds and thirds, we'll be going on in the next lecture to the intervals of sixths and sevenths. Thank you.